Thank you guys for coming out tonight and joining us on the webinar. I'm excited tonight. It's key aspects of instrument flying. So I know a lot of you guys are probably private pilots or people who are working on their instrument pilots, instrument rating rather, and are just looking to get additional knowledge on that rating. Now, tonight, I wanted to keep it nice and surface level for us to understand the key concepts, really digging in. So this is part one of a part two segment where we're going to go a little bit more in depth, right? We're going to go a little bit and dive deeper. So for those of you who haven't met me or seen me at the airport, my name is Michael Colley. I'm a CFII here at Princeton Flying School since August of 2022, and I've been enjoying my time here since. 2013 was my first intro flight at 39 November, and it's been 10 years now. I started flying when I was 15. It was pretty wild, but yeah, from there I got all my additional ratings. But it's all started out there in Princeton Airport for me, and that was my journey there. I'm an audio engineer and IT specialist on the side. That's what I do outside of the airport. I do a lot of convention venues, a lot of corporate venues and structures like that. And then on the side, I do some Raspberry Pi projects. Like there's a heads-up display that I am working on developing with another friend of mine, and distributing using AHRS data to create a functional heads-up display. It's pretty nice. That's me testing it out on another aircraft there. So I get into different things. I really like engineering projects, and I like aviation. I love aviation in the forefront. Nice. So instrument flying. So I want to talk about IFR. So for those of you guys who don't know, IFR, instrument flying rules, when we are going in the clouds, we're primarily flying based off of our instrument or using our instruments as our primary reference. I have this video here. I don't know if you can hear the sound. I don't think you need to hear the sound. Really, the point of this video, right, is
that I can still see a little bit of sunshine peeking through somewhere. But I also had in my head, should turn back to Farmington and stay the night. But I decided to press on. The conditions at Page were supposed to be rainy all next day, and I really wanted to make it in there this day. So I got a little case of get there itis. Always a bad thing for a pilot.
Wow. Yeah, so I don't necessarily think his voiceover is important.
This is where I made mistake number one. This is the moment I should have turned around. But I could still see the ground, and I had just convinced myself it was going to be temporary.
Exactly. Right. So I think that video shows us a pretty keen example of exactly how the weather can change on us so dramatically, right? You could only see in a matter of minutes there for him, it went from looking like this to looking like this. And a lot of times, if you don't have an instrument rating, this can be an emergency event, right? If you don't have that, this can be a critical emergency where you need to get out of. And that's why on the private level, we have you do a lot of these instrument maneuvers so that you know how to make that 180-degree turn. But as an instrument pilot, or being instrument rating, it allows you to go through this kind of weather, right? Flying by reference to the flight instruments. Looking at the statistics, right? We can see here, trying to go to the next slide here. We can see just some statistics. According to the FAA, I had this in the weather slide too. So this is just pulled from there. But you can see, according to the FAA, 30% of aviation accidents are associated with weather-related incidents. 75% of the VFR into IMC accidents involve fatality, right? So I think personally it's incumbent upon us as pilots to work on getting an instrument rating. I think the common saying is a private pilot's license is a license to learn, right? It's a license to learn. And then from there, we get those additional aspects. So what are some of the benefits of an instrument rating? If it wasn't clear enough from that video, fly when and where you want, right? So those destinations that maybe are prohibited due to maybe a low overcast layer, something that maybe 1,800 feet, maybe 1,700 feet, where you wouldn't go otherwise with just being a VFR pilot, right? You can get there, right? You can traverse that weather. You can become a more competent aviator, right? I think a lot of people take this for granted, but when you get that instrument rating, it really fine tunes your motor skills, your from every aspect, whether that's your scanning or whether that's your muscle memory in the cockpit, right? So you become a more competent aviator on there as well. Become a meteorology pro. So I think that's what I'm also going to delve into part two, understanding the charts and the data. But as an instrument pilot, you're able to have a more of an in-depth look at meteorology. I know a lot of private pilots at the airport, we just look at the TAF, we just look at the METAR, and just to see what the present day or the local conditions are at the airport that we're at, or maybe a neighboring airport. But instead of looking at that TAF and seeing that it's going to be raining in a couple of hours, maybe you can answer the question, why is it going to be raining in a couple of hours? And I think that's what the benefit is there. Improved pre-flight planning as well, right? To be an instrument pilot, there's a lot that goes into your pre-flight because there's a lot that can go wrong. So I think achieving your instrument rating helps in that aspect as well. Knowing how to properly fly IFR not only expands circumstances under which a pilot may aviate, it contributes to his or her ability to conduct a safe trip. And I think that's a theme of tonight. All right, let's go into some of the things that we're going to be discussing tonight. And I have it split up into 4 parts and making this portion, again, this is a overview of the kind of general content of an IFR course, or what you need to know before getting in, or for our instrument pilots who are watching today's video, or webinar rather, this will help you reinforce some of that knowledge there. First, we're going to go over some regulations, some light regulations, navigation publications, going over all the navigational publications that are available to us as instrument pilots, navigational aids and IFR systems, and ATC systems and clearances. Excellent. Continuing through regulations. All right. So in order to get your instrument rating, so what do you need, right? The FAA states that you're going to need at least 50 hours of cross-country pilot time, right? And at least 10 of these hours must be in an airplane, of course. And then a total of 40 hours of actual or simulated instrument time on the areas listed in 61 to 65 Charlie. So you can guys check that as well, right? In addition, at least 15 of those instrument flight training hours are from an authorized flight instructor. Now, that is the gist of it right there. Now, I don't want you guys to take this for granted, because just like your private pilot's license, it took, the minimum was 40, but the national average is more like 90, right? So you kind of have to take that into account when you're looking at it. But you can see under a Part 61 operation, the FAA requires you to get those 50 hours of cross-country flight time. And that really sharpens your skills as a private pilot, going places, going those far distances and exploring the world. So I urge you guys to take that time to explore, to check out new places, locations, things of that nature, and also sharpening your skills, but also meeting with an instructor to work on simulating that instrument time throughout your cross-country experience. All right, cool. Excellent. Continuing through. All right, so those are some of the overarching requirements. Now, can the aircraft fly IFR? Now, when we're looking at 91.205, I know you guys are familiar with atomato flames. Right, atomato flames are flaps for the nighttime. But in addition to those requirements to fly instrument, you're going to need grab cards. So this is what we use here on this level: a generator and radios, attitude indicators, a ball or inclinometer, a clock, an altimeter, a rate of turn indicator, and the directional gyro. And, going down the list, you need a generator, right, to generate that electricity there, right? You need a radio, right, of course, to communicate with air traffic controls in the clouds. You need an attitude indicator, right, of course, to see your attitude when you're in IMC conditions. Of course, the ball to keep yourself coordinated under these conditions, and then a clock, right, for our timed approaches or our timed turns around holding fixes. Of course, an altimeter to understand your height above the ground, your rate of turn indicator, right, to keep standard rate under instrument conditions, or as a backup, let's say that your attitude indicator, the vacuum goes for that instrument. And then, of course, the directional gyro for understanding your position, right? So these are the required instruments that you need to have on board the aircraft in addition to the other 91.205 requirements. So make sure that you have those equipped as well. All right. So now continued whether or not the aircraft can fly instrument conditions, right? So we have 91.411 where it states that no person may operate an airplane, helicopter, or controlled airspace. Generally just summarizing the static and transponder check, right? So we want to make sure those things are also fulfilled in terms of maintenance and airworthiness requirements before we go up in an IFR capability or an IFR flight plan. Now, in 91.171, it also lists that a VOR has to be checked within 30 days. If you plan to use a VOR as your primary reference or using that as your primary mode of navigation, that needs to be checked within the last 30 days. Now, this is something that you can do on your own. There are some stations around certain airports that will allow for this check. So you'll typically see this in the airport facility directory book or the chart supplement, either or, right? Or it's the same book, just different words. You're able to see in there at certain airports the location on the field where you can test your VOR. You place your aircraft on the point. It's usually marked on the ground, and you're able to run through the check using your facility directory. Typically, you're going to dial the OBS to the from indication to what's listed inside the book, and then just measuring the difference between two VORs. On the ground, you're looking for a plus or minus 4, and then in the air, you're looking for a plus or minus 6 there, right? So you have, you can check that. And then in the aircraft, you must have a logbook of the name, date, time, place that you checked the VOR so that it is kept up to date there if you plan on using that. Now, in a modern day system, we're typically using a variety of systems such as GPS, such as a variety of other, typically just GPS these days, if I'm being honest, to navigate. But having that VOR as backup, or if you're going to an airport where there's only a VOR approach, then you're going to have that there. All right, continuing through. Well, let's see. Can you fly IFR, right? So now in 91.173, ATC clearance on a flight plan is required, right? Of course, right? You need to file an IFR flight plan and then receive appropriate ATC clearance. And then 61.57 in order to keep your currency, in order to maintain your instrument rating privileges, you will need to do 6 hits, right? Us instrument pilots are very, very familiar with this. 6 hits, for those of you that don't know, you need to stay current with your IFR training. And that involves 6 instrument approaches, holding procedures and tasks, intercepting and tracking courses through the use of navigational or electronic systems, right? So we need to make sure that we do that within 6 calendar months of our last instrument flight. And then the FAA offers us a nice 6-month grace period thereafter. And so in total, you have just about 12 calendar months to get that done. But don't let that go over, or it's going to involve an IPC or another check with on a higher level, right? All right, cool. Next. Now we're going to go straight into a navigational chart. So again, this is just a synopsis of all the navigational charts that are available to us as instrument pilots. Now, I highly recommend that anyone, even if you just have a private pilot's license, right, take a look at the en route chart on your ForeFlight. It is included, I believe, in the basic package for free. The low charts will be delineated under 18,000 feet and the high charts above that. But typically you're going to be looking at the low charts. And then in the ForeFlight's document tab, you can also search up for the legend, right? And this legend will guide you at looking at that chart. Typically it's going to be filled with a lot of Victor Airways. You see these black lines here, Victor Airways, that are going all along the routes. And then in blue, you have your GPS airways, or airways that are only available via GPS, right? And it's important to know these things as a VFR pilot, because if you look at the VFR sectional, you'll see those blue lines that are kind of crossing, especially in the practice area. You'll see a bunch going to the Solberg VOR, because the Solberg VOR is a major intersection section to start approaches into New York, right? So understanding that there are routes going overhead or through your path of flight can give you a little bit more contextual information about what avenues or ways to avoid. But as an instrument pilot, it's important to know on this chart depicted, right, we'll have minimum en route altitudes, we'll have minimum obstruction clearance altitudes, we'll have changeover points, minimum reception altitudes, and crossing altitudes, which you can go and dive in depth. The purpose of this is to navigate the lateral limits of a designated airway and altitude inconsistent with your ATC clearance. Your ability to fly instruments safely and competently in this system is greatly enhanced by understanding this data. And this helps, of course, right? So even if you lose communication with air traffic control, you can use the markings for the minimum en route altitudes and the minimum crossing altitudes to determine what is your safest altitude along each route of flight, or minimum obstacle clearing altitudes, right? If you're trying to avoid obstacles and natures of that. And we'll go into more in depth on that on part 2 as well. Continuing through, right, we have instrument approach charts, right? So I know a lot of us who are just getting into it are looking at that instrument approach procedure chart and are just learning how to initially brief. But each section, a lot of people don't, well, some people don't know that each section has a specific name for going down that sequence. So at the top, you're going to have a briefing strip. And typically, this is going to have comments, the communications panel, so that you know each communication going into that airport. So this top panel here, the briefing strip, understanding the runway landing elevation. The runway landing feet, and then the touchdown zone elevation, as well as the airport elevation included as well. In addition, you have approach course and WASP channel information, and it's different for each type of approach. So VOR approaches, you're going to have the VOR information in that box there. Or if you're doing an ILS approach, you'll have the ILS frequency in there as well. Next, we have the plan view listed underneath there, right? So the plan view is a top-down view, that approach plate, right, giving you a synopsis of where your aircraft is coming from. Typically, it's going to be facing north, right? So you're going to be oriented in the direction that you're coming from. It'll give you a view of those initial approach fixes, the final approach fix, where you're going to begin your final approach, and the different altitudes along those routes, right? So you're going to have that depicted there. As well, you have the minimum safe altitude, right? So you'll have that. Sometimes it's depicted with quadrants, right? So understanding that your minimum safe altitude may change based off the direction that you're coming from. Usually it'll be delineated by a fix, right? So this one has a fix in the middle, runway 07. So it's saying 25 nautical miles of runway 07. Your minimum safe altitude in this case is 3,000, right? Then underneath that, you have the profile view. So whenever, typically in aviation, when you say profile, you're talking about the side view in terms of descent aspect, right? So it's showing you your different descending altitudes that you'll need to maintain. So you could see you have 2,000 here with a line below. It's saying no lower than 2,000 for this approach here, right? For this waypoint SRAC. And then going to the final approach fix, which has the Maltese cross. So you'll see this little X mark here, which is called the Maltese cross. This delineates what is the final approach fix. And then from there, you will start the descent into the runway there. And then going down, we have our landing minimum strips. So you'll have different landing minimums with different categories. This is usually determined by the approach speed of the aircraft. In the Cessna, yes, technically, you're supposed to use A for that, but sometimes I find myself using B because whenever I do instrument approaches, I like to come in. I know my RPM settings so that I'm steadily coming in at 90 knots. So typically that's going to push me over into the Bravo category and then so on and so forth. But you can see the different minimums for each of those categories, right? You have lateral precision and vertical guidance decision altitude. You have your LNAV, your lateral nav, and a vertical nav with your decision altitude for that. And then you have your MDA there with also circling approaches where you're going into the field and uh, instead of going directly at that runway, let's say you're going to an airport that only has one instrument approach for one runway, but the winds are favoring the other runway. If it offers a circling approach, you can glide on down to these circling minimums. And then if you can see the airport, you'll do a 1.3 nautical mile circle around that airport to land on the opposite end of the runway there, right? So some of the key items there, again, Maltese Cross, you have your visual descent point. So you do have it there depicted in V. And oftentimes you'll see that little gray kind of cone indicating that from that point, you'll be clear of all obstacles to the end of the runway there. Right. Of course, you have reporting points as well, minimum safe altitudes, as we discussed. And then in the box, which I forgot to discuss here in the briefing information strip, you have your alternate takeoff minimums, which we're going to discuss in the later slide. And then your glide slope intercept altitude, of course, with this lightning bolt here. Right. So you can see how the 2000 has a line underneath it saying no lower than 2000 until Dunmore, which is the final approach fix. But you can see that little arrow there has a lightning, like it kind of looks like a lightning bolt, indicating that that is your glide slope intercept altitude. Excellent. All right, continuing through. So oftentimes, for example, this approach plate, this is the RNAV GPS for ORL. Oftentimes, you're going to see a ILS approach, right? That has a suffix with a letter type, right? So you're going to see Yankee or Zulu with that instrument approach. That means that there is more than one procedure to a same runway that uses that navigational system. So oftentimes you're going to see this at the bigger airports that have multiple approaches for different variety of situations. They differentiate this procedure. You're going to see the letters going through Sierra, through Zulu, all through that, right? So you may have multiple different approach types. So just make sure that you're getting from approach, which approach that you're using there. And then for VOR approaches, it's not necessarily the same thing. So for VOR approaches, you have different letter types for through A through C. These circumstances happen when a VOR approach is a circle approach only, right? Or when an approach is over 30 degrees from the runway threshold. So typically you're going to see that delineated with the alphabetical letter there. Nice. Excellent. So also, in addition to the instrument approach charts and so on and so forth there, next we have, let's see if we get there. Takeoff minimums, ODPs, and alternate mins. So I've jumbled this up again, just an overview structure of it. Some airports require takeoff minimums where you have to take off at a specific rate of climb or an obstacle departure procedure. Let's say there is a specific obstacle that you need to avoid. It's very, very important that we check that the airport that we're departing from does not have one of these mandated requirements to keep. Like, so I had some example. For example, this is Dixon, North Dakota. This is one that I had taken off out of previously on runway 25. It says climb on a heading of 250 to 3,500 feet before turning left. Right. And it would list some obstacle notes. And usually these are packaged with your approach plates. Right. So you'll be able to see them, and they're in the ForeFlight tabs there under your departure plates and procedures. Of course, like I told you guys before as well, you have alternate mins. So let's take a look at the plate again. So you'll see this triangle here, right? A little A in the middle of that triangle. That indicates that there may be some alternate minimums for this airport, right? So if you're using this as an alternate, you can see you have the standard alternate minimums. So if your alternate airport has a precision approach, you're looking at 602 as your minimums for the cloud height and the distance, the visibility distance, versus a non-precision, right? 802, right? So we'll have that. Of course, Typically, on the included in the approach documents on ForeFlight, you'll have those non-standard restrictions if there are any, and then so on and so forth for helicopters and U.S. military aircraft. So you'll see that there as well. All right, good. So that is just a synopsis of some of the documents that are available to us as instrument pilots whenever we're making these approaches or going en route. So these are primary navigational documents there. Continuing through, now I want to talk about, let's see. Oh, missed this one here. Departure and terminal arrivals. So we have SIDS and STARS as well in IFR flying. For example, this is an arrival route. And I don't know if you've ever been driving along the turnpike and you've seen aircraft in a line with lights behind each other looking like stars following each other. It's because they're all on a standard terminal arrival route, right? This one is the Pauling 2 arrival into the New York airspace. And this, because it's called the Pauling 2, it starts at Pauling, but you'll have some fixes that your primary route will end off of. For example, if you're coming in from the Albany VOR or the Chester VOR, it will have directional information where you can go to the Athos fix. And then from there to Pauling to start the terminal arrival. So this is what a lot of the bigger jets will use going along the route of flight. You need at least a textual description, and they always include it here, right? The arrival route description. So if you're coming from the Albany transition, you'll be able to see that very well spelt out. So you'll have that, or you can follow the depiction on the map. And you can see it drops you off right at the Deer Park fix, which will transition you over to an instrument approach procedure with your approach plates, right? So you'll be able to transition straight from the arrival route to the instrument plate, the approach plate rather. Of course, this is what a lot of the bigger jets use, so they can be properly spaced and the ATC can sequence them, but you can also request them as a smaller aircraft, and you can deny them if ATC requests that of you. You can also deny that as well in the case that's needed. All right, continuing through. All right, so now I wanted to go through some of the navigational aids and IFR systems that are on board the aircraft that we can use in order to fly safely. All right, so in this section, I had a lot of the six-pack that I wanted to go over, but I'm going to be exploring that in depth for IFR flying a little bit later on in part 2. But first, I wanted to go over some VOR information here. So understanding a VOR a little bit more in depth as it relates to our instrument flying is important, right? Getting a little background information there. It's a VHF omnidirectional range. That's the name of, or that's what VOR stands for, right? Typically, they're referenced to magnetic north, right? But they're sending out radials in all directions that you can hook onto, navigate on, and communicate with in the aircraft. And you've probably done this as a private pilot, but now you can use that as a primary means of navigation on those Victor Airways as a instrument rating. You have different types of VORs that extend in different volumes, right? So you have your terminal VORs that only go up to 12,000 feet. You have your low VORs that go up to 18,000 feet. And then you have your high that can go up to 60,000 feet at times. You can see the different ranges there, right? They span at different widths, determining on the height that you're at, especially the high one, right? At a larger frequency range as well, right? And these are line of sight instruments. And we're going to go into that when we discuss DMEs here in a second. But these are line of sight, and this is a ground-based navigational equipment. You have different types of VORs. Of course, your VORs, general, just omnidirectional beacons that can provide you with direction to your destination. You have VORs that have DME included as well, right? They provide distance measuring equipment, of course, again, line of sight. And then you have VOR TAC, which includes TACAN information. So this is also depicted on both the VFR sectional and the instruments, the IFR low chart, low and high, of course, right? So you're able to see the different types along that route. Nice. So continuing through VORs. What the FAA has also implemented for VORs is something called the minimum operational network. The minimal operational network is I like to think of it as like a promise from the FAA, right? Basically saying that, these VORs are old. I don't know if you've ever seen a VOR up close, but they're old. They're old, antiquated technology. A lot of them don't work. I was flying today. I think a couple of the VORs near us, I don't think are working right now. I'm not sure what's going on, but they always go out of service. They're very expensive to maintain. And, with the advent of GPS, right, a lot of them are being phased out in preference to GPS routes and things of that nature, right, as we change, right? Happened to NDBs, but, nevertheless, the minimum operational network is effectively the FAA says that they're going to make sure that 100 nautical miles within 100 nautical mile range, you're going to keep those VORs active, right? So you at least have that backup source of information. Because yes, GPS is great, but what if happens to those satellites? If those satellites go down, if something happens, um, we need a backup source of navigation, and that ground-based navigation would be the VORs. So I know that's kind of weird to think about, especially here in the Northeast, where you have VORs every single turn, but go out to the Midwest, you're going to start seeing it's going to be very hard to find a VOR out there, or out in the other Western states where they're actually pretty sparse. Of course, you have limitations. You have the cone of confusion, right? You may heard of this when you were doing your private training. When you get close to that VOR, that needle starts getting a lot more sensitive, and you have to be aware of this, especially when you're flying under instrument conditions, because you do not want to be chasing a needle, especially when that can disorient you a lot. Of course. Some of them, if used incorrectly, you could get into a situation where it's reverse sensing. Um, and then, of course, line of sight, right? It's a line of sight instrument where it requires a direct view of an aircraft in order to work. With VORs, full scale deflection on that needle will be 10 degrees at 60 nautical miles. So you can do that math there, right? So at 30 nautical miles, a full scale deflection will be 5 degrees from there. And then before using any VOR, you want to be able to correctly identify that the VOR is usable and that you can get the information from the Morse code ID, right? So you're going to click on that nav button, you're going to click on the ID, and you're going to hear that Morse code that you can validate on your chart as well. All right, so continuing through components, right? You have a ground station and aircraft receiver. And you have the instrument, of course, right? So the ground station connects to the receiver and then the instrument. We already discussed the checks, right? So every 30 days, you need to want to get a check. You can either do it airborne or on the ground. And of course, again, this is only if you plan on using VOR as your primary mode of navigation or your only source of, let's say it's your only approach at an airport. You want to make sure that you have that up to date or checked. You can suffice it with a GPS. Let's say you're using your GPS and your VOR as a backup. You may not need to do the VOR check, but if you're using it as a primary means of navigation, and these are the items that need to be signed off in in the book or the log that you're using: the date, the error, the place, and the signature, of course. All right, continuing through there. This is measuring equipment. So when we're, again, some VORs have distance measuring equipment. I think these, oftentimes in an aircraft, you're going to have like a separate avionic pack that will be able that is slaved to your nav1 or your nav2 that's able to indicate your distance. It's tuned automatically with the VOR, the localizer you're using. It's timed RF pulses. So I like to relate it to, I don't know if there's any IT guys in here. I like to relate it to like packets where an aircraft is going to send out a signal to the VOR, and the VOR is going to see that packet. It's going to send out another packet to the aircraft, and it's going to go back and forth, kind of like timed pulses. And then it effectively creates a handshake to send and transmit. For example, right here, the airborne DME unit transmits an interrogation signal, right? So it probes the ground DME facility receives, and then it replies, right? So they create a handshake signal in the sky, and that's how your aircraft is connected to that ground-based DME structure. But again, same errors, line of sight and slant range distance you want to be aware of. And due to the slant range error, when you're flying overhead of a DME, you're going to see greater than 0. So if you're flying on top of a VOR station, your DMA is probably going to show maybe 1 or 2, depending on how many miles you're up in the sky. Again, slant range distance, so it's showing that slant there. All right, now we go to ILS, right? So the instrument landing system, right? So you have different types of categories: Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3. Cat 1, anyone can fly, and Cat 2 and Cat 3, typically you're going to have special equipment and special training with that. You have ground components to your ILS system. So you have the localizer, you have the glide slope, you have the marker beacons, and the approach lighting system, which we'll go into a little bit more in depth. And then you have the airborne components, your localizer, your glide slope inside the aircraft. You have your marker beacon receiver. That's what that little nub on the bottom of the Cessna is for. And then your DME, of course. Errors: radio reflection, radio waves bouncing. I wish I had a picture of this, but sometimes you'll go to some airports and you'll see there is an ILS boundary. So when you're taxiing to the runway, you'll see it's almost like a grid shape. I wish I had a picture. Maybe I'll add it into the notes a little bit after for the presentation, but it's an ILS boundary. The reason why is because if your aircraft goes past that, the radio waves that are guiding aircraft in for that ILS are going to bounce off your aircraft and then prohibit those aircraft from coming in safely. So be keen and listen to the controller's responses on those very cloudy or low visibility days when people are using that ILS system. Do not cross the ILS boundary if you are given explicit instructions not to do so. And then, of course, false courses, which we'll go into there as well. Of course, you have the localizer, which provides lateral course guidance, right, on the frequencies of 108.1 through 111.95. The best thing about this, you can't mix and match this. A lot of people, they look at this and like, what's prohibiting me from putting that in the comms by accident, right? The comms are in a whole different range of frequencies than the localizer frequencies or VOR frequencies, so you can't mix and match them. Of course, typically a width of 3 and 6 degrees, right? So you want to be aware of this so that when you are closer to the runway, it strategically puts it so that when you're at the end of the runway, typically is about 700 feet wide, usually 5 degrees total width from either side, and you can see that there in the image. And then, of course, the coverage range, 35 degrees each side of the center line for the first 10 nautical miles, and then 10 degrees up to 18 nautical miles. So typically, when you're passing by an airport, if you see that outer marker beacon flash, or if you see that localizer spike up, you know that it's generally within 18 nautical miles from the airport. Then, in addition to that, on the aircraft, you'll have a glide slope indicator on your CDI. Glide slope indicator provides vertical course guidance, right, down to the ground. So in addition to the localizer, your lateral, and then your glide slope when coming in. Frequencies, 329.3. I mean, you don't need to know these frequencies because typically this is not visible to you. It's slave to the localizer. So as soon as you download the localizer, it's going to tune into that UHF. That is going to be about a 1.4, and then the range goes out to 10 nautical miles. That's why sometimes you get the localizer, but you won't necessarily get the glide slope until you're closer in. And of course, the slope is typically around 3 degrees, may change for different approaches. Of course, you have some errors. I know that I was tested on this on my check ride. Be aware that some examiners might test you out. They may have you come in at a higher altitude, and then you'll probably start seeing glide slope start coming in and start following it. And if that doesn't feel right, if you're at the wrong altitude, at the wrong position, and you're understanding in your head, you're going like, yes, the glide slope is here, but it doesn't make sense to be here, you can assume that you'll have a false glide slope there. So be mindful of that. All right, cool. continuing through there. You'll have marker beacons, right? So marker beacons are a good aid when coming into instrument approaches, right? I'm not going to go over all of this for the use of time, but it transmits on 75 megahertz outer marker, about 4 to 7 miles out. And you can usually, in the aircraft, you see that blue light on the intercom there with the Morse code with the dash, dash, dash. And then you have the middle marker, right? As you get a little bit closer to the runway, indicating that you're about 3,500 feet from the runway, you'll have that amber dot, dash, dot, dash. And then that inner marker, you'll have the dot, 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 which is indicated in white that you're right where the glide slope meets that decision height there. On a category 2, you're not going to necessarily need that, but there's good validation that you're going along the course and the route in the flight there. Continuing through ADFs and NDBs. It's on the ACS, so it is there, but typically you're never really going to see this given to you on a checkride, especially if you don't have anyone functional in your aircraft. You'll be able to. ADF is a automatic direction finder, and the NDB is a non-directional radio beacon. The non-directional radio beacon, the NDBs, are ground-based systems. They're very rare these days. They have a majority of them have been phased out. But in order to use that, you're going to need to use the ADF. They have a saying here: magnetic heading plus your relative bearing equals your magnetic bearing. You're going to use that on the ADF to find your route of flight. Full disclosure, this is just a synopsis of it. I've never used one myself, right? Full disclosure. But nevertheless, this is a method of navigating. So if you do have time, definitely go and try it out if you can get one of the aircraft that have it equipped. Nice. Excellent. So once we go through there, so we have the radio magnetic indicator inside the aircraft, right? You have your bearing indicator, you have your heading indicator as well in there. And then inside it's operated, it has a flux valve. So not like a typical gyroscopic that you'd see in a directional indicator. It's called a flux valve using that magnetic difference there to kind of accept the frequency from the NDB, and still using that same formula there. Excellent. Last thing I want to discuss here on this topic, and generally the presentation, is going through the global positioning system. Global positioning system is one that we use in instrument flying a lot, even for our VFR flying. So it's very important that we understand how it works. I think a lot of people don't really dive in depth into the global positioning system, or the GPS. It's a constellation that consists of 24 satellites, and I think that's really impressive that our governments, I think combined, have been able to send up 24 satellites that are orbiting the Earth, so that wherever we are, we should be able to at least accept a couple of satellites. In the United States, they've designed it so that we have at least 5 satellites in view in any given location in the United States or any given location on Earth. But technology can sometimes fail. And it's very, very keen to be aware of this when you are an instrument pilot. At least 3 satellites are required for 2D positioning. At least 4 satellites are for 3D. And then you'll need a total of 5 satellites to have random autonomous integrity monitoring, where it's monitoring the integrity of each of these additional satellites to make sure that they're sending you the appropriate information, that you're receiving the decibel of information for position. And then you can have a total of 6 satellites where it can hot swap each of the satellites depending on the needs or the situation. Let's say one satellite goes down, so on and so forth. So it's a massive redundancy system. And inside the 430, you can actually go to that separate menu on the aux page to see the integrity of your satellites. And then in addition, on some 430s, you have the validation of the RAIM, understanding you can predict in the future, depending on the position of the satellites, whether or not you're going to have RAIN functionality at your destination. So that's a cool capability of that, because they're all moving in a predictive motion around the Earth, right? So that 430 can predict based off the time, the day, where those satellites are going to be and where to pick up. It's actually pretty impressive. All right, continuing through GPS, you're going to have a CDI. It's very important to note, a lot of people get this confused. The CDI deflection on a VOR shows your angular distance, whereas the GPS needle shows your distance off course, right? So it's a little bit different positioning off of that. Of course, so the VOR, it's in degrees, whereas your GPS is showing you from the course your distance off of, right? And you want to make sure that you don't get those two confused when you're navigating. But in essence, they operate kind of off of the same principle. On a lot of approaches, they can replace ADFs or DMEs, which is why you don't really see a lot of people using NDBs on those approaches there. Finishing up the slides here, right? Continuing through, we have satellite-based augmentation systems, right? Where you have wide area augmentation systems, WAS on the ground, right? Ground stations that will also help validate the integrity of the satellites and improve correction. They'll offer correction signals. So let's say a satellite is not behaving correctly or not providing sufficient information, right? The WAS will step in and help improve and correct the signals, improve the accuracy, the integrity of it, covers a super wide area, and it helps facilitate more of the advanced approaches, precision approaches such as LPV, LNAV, and LP approaches. You also have the GBOS, which is more of a it's more accurate system, but it covers a less of a wide area than the WAS system, right? Much smaller geographical area, allows for category 1 approaches, but not necessarily used in the Cessna there. All right. Then you have RNP, right? So you have some approaches that on the top of the approach plate, you'll see RNP, which is required navigational performance. And I like to consider this kind of like a statement, right? Now, RNP really states that there is a level of equipment and service performance that you're going to need on a certain approach. And that's important to take a look at depending on which approach that you're using to make sure that you are making sure that you are you have the appropriate equipment on board to facilitate that instrument approach, right? So a lot of those RNP approaches are titled RNAV GPS, right? And some RNAV approaches require special authorization, right? And I like to think of these approaches that aren't in the most remote places in the United States where there's very, very limited options to go around or very, very limited options to maneuver around caverns. You may need additional authorization from the FAA or additional training to shoot that approach, right? And that goes into the RNP approaches as well. And you can see there I've listed a couple of those approaches that require special equipment in order for, such as your GLS approaches, your LP. And again, we're going to go over a lot of this in depth in part 2 and what these are. And then the last slide here, the global positioning system, just a synopsis. You have the global positioning system. You have RAIN navigation. It solves for your location. You have your user segment, your control segment, and your space segment, right? So those are the different phases, right? Out there in space, the control segment, and then the user segment, which is you, right? So the different elements of that. You have WAS. It improves on your GPS. So WAS is ground-based systems that help with the integrity of the GPS. And then you have increased approach capabilities because of WAS. And then you have GBOS. Or LAS, which has more augmentation with the WAS as well. But of course, guys, I appreciate you guys staying with my presentation tonight and getting a firsthand kind of intro to some of the equipment that we use when we're going IFR. So the next slide I have here, we'll keep this for part 2, the ATC clearances. But continuing through, let's skip this for now. We'll come back to this. But what I wanted to kind of end off with is that instrument flying enables us to fly out of bad weather safely. Now, this is a quote that a old flight instructor of mine kind of gave me, because I think a lot of times we go into the mindset of instrument flying, or having our instrument rating enables us to go into bad weather. I think we have a culture of saying having this instrument rating enables me to go straight into that cloud or go into this weather confidently. Yes, it does. However, I think if we go into instrument flying with the mindset of it enables us to fly out of bad weather safely, I think that will lead to a better safety culture. So with your new instrument rating, or with if you're aspiring to reach an instrument rating, understand that you can always say no to a flight. You can always decide to no-go. Having an instrument rating does not enable you to fly through every and anything. And sometimes it's not the wisest option to fly through the things that you could otherwise do, right? So you want to have that better judgment. And then in the case that you're flying and then you do find yourself in bad weather, just like the video that I had at the top, you are well equipped to pick up a pop-up clearance and to navigate out of that bad weather. All right, guys, with that, we're going to pick this up again in part 2, where we can kind of go over some ATC clearances and go over some more instruments in depth. But I appreciate you guys staying on the line with me. And with that, I want to ask you guys if there's any questions that you have. Oh, wait, can't do it without the next slide. Questions, right? So if you have any questions, I do see some things in the chat here. Let me pop that open. Oh, there we go. I think Joe had a picture of the ILS boundary. Thank you, Joe. I should have put that in about ILS boundary marking. That's really, really well to identify, because given an instruction to hold short of the ILS boundary is at the same level of a hold short instruction, because you can mess up approach very easily. But yes, any questions? Don't be shy. Not all at once. I like that line. All right, guys. All right.
And if there's any questions or anything that you want to see explained more in the second part of the instrument webinar, this is a great time to let us know.
Mike, it's Alan. I have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
Of our C-172s at Princeton, which ones have all the necessary working equipment to actually fly IFR right now?
Nice. So, that's awesome. So from what I've been told, this may have changed, but we like to keep the databases up to date for 5338 November and 298 Mike Charlie, right? So those are two ones that you can use with the databases all up to date. There may be more, right? So definitely ask the front desk about that if you request a certain aircraft to be up to date.
Okay.
Yeah, it's those two, and you can then, if you wanted to do the Diamond, the DA-40.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
But you did say specifically the Cessna, so you're right.
Yes. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. All right. Well, we'll go to the next slide here. Thanks for listening, guys. I really appreciate you guys for sticking out, especially on a nice night like this. But I hope I did offer and share any additional information or teach you something new, or even for the experienced instrument pilots, maybe cleared up a topic or a nav aid that you didn't otherwise know. And then, of course, part 2, I'm going to be going more in depth on some of the more clearances and things of that nature.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right, sounds good, everybody. Have a great night.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for providing that.
Yes, sir. It's a pleasure.
I really like it. Thank you very much.
Nice. I'll see you guys up in the skies.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice job, Mike.
All righty. Good
We'll
night.
see you next month.
Thanks, Mike.
I'm looking forward for part 2.
There we go. Nice.